Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today's video we're going to be talking about the Arizona Cardinals fantasy football preview for the 2021 season. I'm going to be going through the quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, defense, and kicker. All the positions that you'll start in fantasy football for the Cardinals. I'm going to be doing that for every team this summer, all 32 teams, previewing the players that I like for this coming fantasy football season, players I don't like, and so hopefully this will help you going into your fantasy football season for next year to help give you some ideas, some stuff to think about so you can win your league next year. That's what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to help you guys win your fantasy football league with some of my strategies that have worked for me in the past. So if you're interested in stuff like these, please like, comment, and subscribe. Additionally, if you can guess the name of the song that I started out with in this video, the first person to guess it in the comment section will get a guaranteed fantasy football question answered for them. Although honestly, like, if you can't figure out the name of that song, I don't know what to say, because I've given you quite a bit of hits. I'm just going to leave it like that. But anyway, I make a lot of stuff on this channel. I also talk about the NBA. I also make song covers. The last song that I made was a Dreams cover. And then I also react to songs as well, and talk about some other stuff too. So if you're interested in a wide variety of content, please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. But let's talk about the Arizona Cardinals. And what I'd like to do with them is to start out with their schedule for the 2021 season, because this gives you a good gauge of how their players could perform at different points of the season. So, and for the Cardinals, they start out with a very light schedule. That's one of the biggest takeaways I have from the Cardinals schedule. They start out week 1 against Tennessee, not a very good defense. Week 2, home against Minnesota, average to below average defense. And then week 3, they go to the Jacksonville Jaguars, which was by far the worst defense in the NFL last year. So what that means is that if you have guys on this Arizona Cardinals roster that I'm going to be talking about in this video, or even other players, they could have a very good start to the season. And what that means is that if you capitalize on their quick start to the season, you could flip them for better players. That is the key to being successful in fantasy football, is making sure that you're flipping your assets for better players. Kind of like in the NBA, for example. And especially going into week 4, 5, and 6, the Cardinals have got the Los Angeles Rams, the San Francisco 49ers, and the Cleveland Browns at week 4, 5, and 6. So those all project to be pretty good defenses. So if you really want to capitalize on this team's value and try to flip players, you got to do that in the first 3 weeks of the season. They do have a nice looking playoff schedule, though. They play the Detroit Lions in week 15, the Indianapolis Colts in week 17, and the Dallas Cowboys, the Colts are in week 16 and the Cowboys are in week 17. I'm assuming that week 18 is going to kind of be an off week for fantasy football playoffs, kind of similar to how it's been in the past. But we'll have to wait and see. So let's take a look now at the Cardinals roster. We'll start with their quarterback position. And I'm just going to be upfront with you. I really like Kyler Murray for the 2021 fantasy football season. And the reason I really like Kyler Murray and Russell Wilson and Deshaun Watson, if he's able to play, and guys like that, is because quarterbacks that run the football always give you a baseline. Lamar Jackson is another example of that. I talked about this a little bit in the last video with Matt Ryan, but when you have quarterbacks that are good at running the football in addition to throwing it, then what happens is that you're always going to have a floor to work with. So if a quarterback, for example, has a bad game, he throws a touchdown, but he also has 3 interceptions. If they're not a running quarterback, they're not going to give you a baseline level of points. But if you got a guy like Kyler Murray or Lamar Jackson, for example, then they're going to give you maybe 60 to 80 yards rushing in a game, maybe a touchdown as well. So even if they had a bad game throwing the football, they're still giving you a good baseline based on their rushing totals. So when they do go off, especially when they're running for touchdowns and throwing for touchdowns, it just doubles up your points. So I really like Kyler Murray. And then especially if you can get a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, who I'm going to talk about, with your first round pick, for example, I would especially like a situation where you get Kyler Murray maybe in the 3rd or 4th round, depending on how he falls on the draft board. We'll wait and see. But he could have a breakout season. He arguably had one last year, but I think things are going to get even better for him as the team is improving and he's getting more experience. So this is definitely one of my favorite quarterback options for fantasy football. One of the items of note, though, is that their backup quarterback is Colt McCoy, which is interesting to me because Colt McCoy is a completely different type of quarterback than Kyler Murray. I would have thought that this team would have invested in a guy that also runs the football, like maybe Tyrod Taylor or Marcus Mariota or something like that, to try to mirror the same style as Kyler Murray, but they're not doing that. So if for some reason Kyler Murray gets hurt, that significantly will affect the rest of the offense. But let's try not to think about that. But anyway, so Kyler Murray, definitely want to get him if you can, but understand that he's probably going to go pretty high in the draft, so you might have to make some sacrifices to your other positions if you're going to acquire a guy like Kyler Murray. Running backs. So the running back picture for the Arizona Cardinals next year, they just picked up James Conner from the Pittsburgh Steelers. They let Kenyon Drake go. He signed with the Las Vegas Raiders. And also on their team, they've got Chase Edmonds, a guy who's been in the system and did pretty well last year as their number 2 back. So this is going to kind of fall in the similar structure as it did with the Cardinals last year, where Chase Edmonds is the 3rd down receiving back. James Conner is more of that goal line bruiser that's going to get you the touchdowns, kind of similar to what Kenyon Drake did last year. Both players in PPR formats were right next to each other, actually. James Conner was number 27. Chase Edmonds was number 28. Personally, I like Chase Edmonds more than James Conner because of that passing yardage that you're going to get, especially in a PPR league. Chase Edmonds last year had, I believe, 53 receptions on 67 targets. So Kyler Murray really likes throwing to this guy, and Chase Edmonds actually had a lot of lingering injuries last year as well. So his numbers could improve theoretically even more because of the fact that he was injured for part of the year. And James Conner, a guy who, especially with Pittsburgh, had a difficult time staying healthy, did not look particularly good last year. Connor, I would not be surprised at all if he had a breakout season with Atlanta and manages to have a really good season for Arizona. But there's a lot of risk with him, and frankly, to me, I'd rather avoid that. I'd rather go with a guy like Chase Edmonds, who's going to have a higher floor. And you can pick up Chase Edmonds a lot later, too, because he's a guy that's not very well known on the team. Guys are going to go more with James Conner as their running back options is what I would guess in terms of how they're going to manage this team. Or, I mean, how they're going to draft these 2 running backs. And then they've also got some guys in the backfield as well, like Eno Benjamin, and some younger players, Tavian Feaster, Jonathan Ward, guys like that, who are younger players that could technically step up as well in passing down situations as well. So, because Arizona likes to, I guess, for lack of better words, surprise people with the running back situation. The last 2 years, it's kind of been an influx of guys in and out of the backfield stepping up at different times. So just keep that in mind as you're planning around how to approach this running backfield, because it could eventually end up as a committee. But if you have to go with anybody, I would go with Chase Edmonds from this backfield. The receiving options. This projects to be one of the best receiving corps in the NFL for next year, and it starts with the guy at the top, DeAndre Hopkins. He's a top 5 fantasy football player, a top 5 fantasy football wide receiver. He did extremely well last year. I was actually worried about DeAndre Hopkins going into last season because I wasn't sure how he was going to do with other options like Christian Kirk, guys like that. Because in Houston, he was always pretty much the only guy that Deshaun Watson could throw to. So I was a little worried that Hopkins could have a dip in his numbers. But he actually had, I believe, his career high in receptions. Let me go back and double check this. But yeah, so he tied his career high. So he had 115 receptions which tied at what he had in 2018. He had 1,407 yards. His touchdowns dipped a little bit with Arizona. Of course, he had that miraculous touchdown at the Hail Mary that everybody remembers from last year. But this guy is the real deal at wide receiver. He's going to continue to get a lot of targets from Kyler Murray. This is how I'm approaching this season. If he's available as a top in the first round, I'm going to take him. Because, and I'm going to get into this later, but it's better to have an elite wide receiver, in my opinion, in your first round draft pick than an elite running back, because there's less risk of that receiver getting hurt. Granted, there are exceptions, Michael Thomas last year, namely, but running backs are always in flux of who's going to have good weeks and bad weeks because they get injured more frequently. But if you have a lockdown receiver, the discrepancy between the elite wide receivers and the mid-tier wide receivers in fantasy football is pretty significant, which is a lot different than it is with running backs. So if you can get a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, Devontae Adams, Michael Thomas when he's healthy, guys like that, maybe even DK Metcalf, that's really going to help your team in fantasy football. So I would prioritize getting a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, especially if you have a late first round pick and he's going to be available for you. Other receivers on this team. So Christian Kirk is a guy that has done well with them in the past. His numbers are going to dip a little bit just simply because of the amount of options that they have. But Kirk is probably the guy that I would take next in terms of how I would rank these receivers, is because Kirk is a guy who's been steadily improving throughout his career, really starting to develop an offense. And the other thing is that he's not going to get drafted as high because they have A.J. Green and Larry Fitzgerald. People are going to make a mistake to draft those two players. I'm going to talk about them in a sec. But Christian Kirk is really the receiver that's up and coming in the system. So it would be wise to take him over a guy like A.J. Green and Larry Fitzgerald. Speaking of those two, those guys followed to the exact example of the hype factor that I talked about a little bit in the last video, that drives up their draft value, puts these guys in a range that they really are not going to perform for the fantasy football season, and then you're going to find that you wasted a pick on somebody that wasn't productive for you. This is no disrespect to them as players because they're both all-time greats. Larry Fitzgerald is a Hall of Famer. A.J. Green, I don't think so, but he was very good for a stretch of his career, one of the elite receivers in the league. But I just don't see them having a good season because there's so many receiving options, and they're both on the tail end of their career and have shown that they are past their prime. A.J. Green did not have a very good year last year with the Bengals. He was injured almost the entire season before that and didn't play. Larry Fitzgerald's numbers have been on the decline for the past 2 or 3 years, especially. These guys are trap players that you do not want to draft. I'm just telling you that right now. But other guys that I would potentially look for that I think will be better options for you on the Arizona Cardinals are Rondale Moore, a receiver they drafted in the second round out of Purdue. He projects to be a very fast, speedy receiver who I think could have a lot of value for the Cardinals as a slot option that Kyler Murray can dink and dunk it off to when he's scrambling out of the pocket, things like that. I think he could surprise a lot of people and be a very productive player. And then another one that is going to be forgotten about as well is Andy Isabella. He's I believe a third-year receiver for them he's very up and down. He's another very fast guy who will have some games where he'll break free for 75-yard touchdowns and other games where he won't do anything. But again, both those guys are worth keeping an eye on because, as I mentioned, their schedule is pretty light early. So I would not be surprised at all if one of those two players have a great week one. You could flip them to get a better receiver or a running back that could be more valuable to you or something to that effect. So just keep an eye out for that because I would not be surprised if something like that were to happen. So very deep wide receiver core, a lot of names to talk about there. Tight end is a lot murkier for this team. So the Arizona Cardinals last season, their top tight end was Dan Arnold. He was pretty good for them, but he signed with the Carolina Panthers. So now their top running back on their depth chart, top tight end on their depth chart is Maxx Williams, who is a player who has been pretty modest throughout his career, not really done a lot. So again, this is a prime opportunity for a void to be filled by a player that is younger, has more potential, and could step up into the system. So they've got a couple rookie tight ends, Ian Bunting out of California, Bruno LaBelle out of Cincinnati, guys like that. They've also got some younger players such as Jordan Thomas, who used to play for the Texans, who kind of never really stuck there. But I think that basically this is a prime example of a situation where you want to make sure that you have players. You don't want to waste a pick on Maxx Williams just simply because he's a starter, because I don't think he's going to put up great numbers necessarily. Keep an eye out for on the waivers of a tight end that is trending in in a good direction for Arizona, because especially a running quarterback like Kyler Murray, he's going to have to pass it to his tight ends, maybe more so than some of the receivers downfield when he's scrambling out of situations where he's getting sacked and things like that. So there's going to be a tight end with some moderate value, I predict, but I don't think it's going to be Maxx Williams. I don't know who that's going to be, but it's worth keeping an eye on. But anyway, don't draft any Arizona tight ends. Just monitor the waiver wires and see what happens as the season progresses. Defense, special teams. Arizona projects to be a better defense for next season. They signed J.J. Watt, even though he's kind of past his prime a little bit. They picked up Zaven Collins in the draft. That was a good draft pick for them, in my opinion. So I think they will be a better defense, in addition to the fact that they already have some good players like Budda Baker, things like that. But you don't want to waste a pick too high on them. And I think that this defense is going to especially go a little higher than their projected. Their draft value is going to be higher than their score value. So I would not reach at the bait and draft Arizona's defense really high if people start taking the Rams defense, the Ravens defense, other things like that early, because I think that ultimately in fantasy football, the best strategy, in my opinion, is save your last two draft picks for the defense and the kicker, because those are the positions that are most commonly streamed, and most commonly there'll be a waiver wire option that does really well for you down the stretch of the season anyway. I talked about this example of Atlanta with Younghoe Koo. Their kicker was mostly not drafted at all, but ended up being one of the best kickers in fantasy football last season. So do not get fooled by the fact that they have J.J. Watt and draft Arizona with your sixth to last draft pick or something to that effect. I know somebody is going to do that in fantasy football, but you do not want to be that guy. I'm just telling you that. Anyway, there's another example of that to a lesser degree with the kicker. Arizona signed Matt Prater from Detroit. Prater is he's got the NFL record for the longest kick of all time. And I think that there's a scenario where he could go pretty high in the draft because people are believing that, their offense is good. He's going to get a lot of opportunity. But again, this is a guy that you want to take a flyer on in the last round only. Prater was only 21 of 28 from field goals last year, and he was 6 of 10 for field goals over 50 yards. So the accuracy is not necessarily what it used to be in the past for him. He's always kind of been like a big leg guy, but not necessarily the most accurate kicker anyway throughout his career. So I would not be jumping to get Matt Prater any higher than the last round. But yeah, that's what I've got for Arizona for this fantasy football season. If you're interested in videos like these, please let me know. I'm planning to go through all these teams alphabetically, so stay tuned and I'll answer some of your fantasy football questions for these teams. So thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.